greed, conspiracies, and lies. These companies are guilty of them all.
Once you remove honesty, the whole stack of cards can come tumbling down.
Well, good morning and welcome to our event, Business Scandals and What to Do About Them, which launches and showcases this new book, Disaster in the Boardroom. We're going to have a debate this morning about improvement. I'm Stefan Stern. I'm your host today for the next 30-40 minutes, where we will be exploring the key themes in the book and what businesses and organisations can do to avoid these scandals and disasters. Thank you for joining us from your home or workplace this morning, and welcome especially to our live audience here at London Business School. That was a cue to clap, but don't worry. This is an interactive day where you, the audience, can ask how these disasters came to fruition and how they can be avoided in the future. To ask a question from home, use the Q&A tab on the Hop-In software, and for the audience here, you can use Slido, and the instructions are on the screen. Joining us today is Gerry Brown, company chairman, esteemed author of several books. They all look at the importance and value of truly independent directors and specialising in improving board culture and corporate governance. And also with us, Randall Peterson, professor of organisational behaviour and academic director here at leader of the Leadership Institute here at London Business School. Also joining us, Sir Dennis Gillings, CBE, who's a British-born American entrepreneur, investor, philanthropist, and founder and former chairman of Quintiles, a global leader in clinical research. We'll also have Heidi Gardner, a distinguished fellow at Harvard Business School and chair of that school's accelerated leadership program. And finally, Liz Barlow, who's the publisher at Business and Management section of Palgrave, Macmillan. So, Gerry, I'll just hand over to you to welcome everyone.
Well, good morning, Stefan, and thank you all who registered for today's book launch, and to all of you who are present here today at London Business School.
Thanks, Gerry. Before we open for questions, let's do some scene setting about the book. Gerry, what was the motivation behind the book, and why is it so relevant and important for us?
Well, Stefan, hardly a week passes without another business scandal happens. For example, just recently we have the P&O crisis. But this issue is not new. It happens all around the world. And then we have the range and extent of these board scandals, which is mind-blowing, from theft, fraud, bribery, privacy and data violations, sexual discrimination, accounting irregularities, just to mention a few. Then it's a problem that cuts across all sectors, from financial services to resource extraction, high-tech to catering, Silicon Valley startups to firms with a century more of history behind them. Then the consequences of these scandals are enormous. They are felt far wider than the company and its shareholders. Social, economic, financial, reputational and environmental damage. The direct impact on people of corporate failures includes the loss of jobs, not just with the company involved, but there is the impact on suppliers, distributors and others in the supply chain. Pension funds also suffer. Then there's the impact on tax revenues, and in the worst case, the government has to step in to save the company. For example, the Royal Bank of Scotland and the cost of the 50 billion bailout. Environmental damage can be extremely serious. For example, the air pollution scandal by Volkswagen and the oil slick disaster in the Gulf of Mexico by BP. And then we have the financial impact of these scandals. For example, the cost to investors in banks, which have been fined over $320 billion. But it does not need to be this way. I know from my experience over many years as a company chairman and board director that there are thousands of well-run businesses and excellent boards of directors. So what needs to happen? Well, we don't need any more regulations. What we need is much better behaviour by boards of directors. So, in conclusion, Stefan, I met the chairman of a company involved in one of the scandals described in the book. And one of his explanations was that there was not a book to help him avoid the scandal. That excuse no longer exists. There is now a practically based guide to avoiding business scandals and therefore avoiding all of the dreadful consequences.
Thank you, Gerry. Well, you've certainly been pursuing this subject for a long time and you know what you're writing about. I know that. But how did the book actually come to fruition?
Well, Stefan, because of the importance of the issue, I wanted to bring it to the attention of the business community and wider society. I met Randall at London Business School and we discovered we had a mutual interest in the topic. Randall is a leading academic who spent much of his life researching boards and their behaviour. So we agreed a programme of research to be carried out by LBS. Palgrave Macmillan agreed to publish the manuscript, and the rest, they say, is history.
Thanks, Gerry. So, Randall, what led you to develop your specific interest in this subject?
Thank you, Stefan. Well, my very first board experience was actually as a student. I was elected by my peers to be on a board, and I saw dysfunction and problem and disaster firsthand, early in life, and actually right then and there resolved to study boards and try to understand what was actually going on, which of course I've now been doing for 30 plus years. And most of it boils down to just some basic stuff about bad behavior and culture, you know, where directors should work together for the benefit of the organization and are basically unable to deliver on that core responsibility.
Yes, you remind me of an early career experience of mine, which inspired me to write about management. But that's another story. What led you to become involved in this with this book with Gerry?
Yeah, so basically I saw what Gerry saw, what he's already spoken about, which is there are disasters everywhere, massive collateral damage, and this has been kind of normalized over the last 300 years as something that's just part of what it takes for the incredible wealth creation that businesses actually do create. And I didn't believe it. I never believed it needed to be that way. And in Gerry, I found a crucial collaborator who actually agreed with me on that point and was willing to really work with me. And also because of his complementary experience and perspective to my own, it just felt like the right project.
Well, the proof is in the in the pages and in the reading, and it's excellent. Thank you. Now, let's hear from Dennis Gillings about why he finds this book so useful and important.
I do think all of Gerry's books, but particularly this last one, which talks about board dysfunctions and how things can go wrong, which the board has ultimate oversight over, is very educational. And it's 1 to 2 days of reading. In my mind, if I was choosing a board all over again, I'd make that a compulsory reading for new board members. Wisdom and the ability to deal with black swans, which I suppose Gerry's book is about, or prevent black swans, is a tough course, particularly, I would say, for a neophyte board member. And I would put myself in that category many years ago. I wish I'd have had this book 35 years ago.
Great. Okay, so we're at a business school, so we've got to get granular. Randall, how can these causes of board behavior be categorized?
Thank you. Well, our review of the research, kind of actual scandals, board responsibilities, revealed 6 different types of boardroom scandals. So the first one is where the board is subordinate to management, and the boards really lack that core independence from management and ability to stand separately. Gerry's been writing about this for a long time. It's a crucial issue. Second was what we're calling bystander boards. That's where nobody takes, because they're collectively responsible, people don't take collective responsibility, and that means things just don't happen, or don't happen quickly enough. There's the imbalance board, where it's all one category, or almost all, and critical key voices are missing. And again, we've got some great examples in here of how when those voices are missing, if they're the voice of your customer, you misjudge your customer. If they're the voice of a particularly important constituency, you probably don't really work with them in the way you should. Fourth one was what I call distended board. That is a culture that has been helpful historically spirals out of control. Our example in this book is Uber. It started off with a very competitive culture and became competitive mean to everybody, including our own employees, really is what it became. Fifth one was bureaucratic boards. Everything is about the structure, the process, the bureaucracy. If we follow all the rules, everything will be right. And as Gerry has already alluded to, just following all the rules isn't enough, and still leaves room for disaster. And then finally, conforming boards, where, one of the things that surprised me when I started doing this work is high status people, former CEO goes onto a board and feels intimidated by the fact that they're new on this board. How does that work? But it does. And then as a result, people can be relatively conforming. And if everybody starts to do that, and it's all about, we're all going to do this together, we're all going to jump off the cliff together, well, sometimes they do literally jump off a cliff. And we've got some good examples in here.
Thank you, Randall. So 50 ways to leave your lover and 6 ways for a board to screw up, at least, but 6 main ways. Thanks. Let's listen now to Heidi Gardner about what the most common types of board dysfunction are, and how can we get people to collaborate together when sometimes they just don't.
Boards really ought to be the essence of what I call smart collaboration. People with different bases of expertise and experiences coming together to tackle tough, complex issues. And yet what we often see in boards is that they're not making the most of this potential experience and expertise. We need board members to build relationships with one another so that they establish not only competence trust in one another, of course, they need to know they're going to deliver high quality solutions, but they also need to have interpersonal trust in one another that makes it safe for them to ask tough questions, challenging questions, and even naive questions with the full confidence that their fellow board members are going to look at them as a stronger board member rather than a weaker one when they do.
Okay, and for good behaviour, Heidi gets a second go, and now she's going to tell us how this book contributes to our understanding of this issue of board disaster.
This book, through its very practical examples and its case studies and its analysis, helps us understand what goes wrong and what goes right in boards. It's that kind of practical understanding that contributes to better board functioning, and it's important not only to the board members themselves, but to a much broader array of stakeholders.
And now Liz Barlow from the publisher, who's going to tell us why they decided to publish the book. Liz.
So at Palgrave Macmillan, our programme is built on books that combine research with practice. Books that have something new to say and have found a new way to say it. And this is actually harder than you might think. Books that have an original stance, that are written in a genuinely approachable way, that strike a chord with the current climate are few and far between. So when I saw the proposal for Disaster in the Boardroom, I thought it completely fits the bill. I mentioned that the book strikes a chord with the current climate, and this was actually a really important factor in deciding to publish it. In my first conversations with Gerry, we discussed how corporate boardroom disasters have a direct effect on our society. And yet, despite all the media coverage that they get and the discussions that we have about them, ultimately, we shrug our shoulders and we move on as if it's inevitable. But this book points out that it doesn't have to be this way, and it presents practical steps that the boards can take to mitigate risk. So we really look forward to the feedback we get from the book, and I hope that the attendees at this launch event will take something valuable from it. Ultimately, when I'm deciding to publish a book, I want readers to enjoy it, to learn something new, and crucially to use what they've learned to implement change. And I'm confident that this book will encourage readers to do just that.
Okay, thank you. Randall, now a big question, but what can be done to improve the cultural dimension of board ineffectiveness, board failure?
Yeah, of course. Well, there are a handful of strategies that that the solid research behind this book really talks about in terms of changing culture. In fact, we dedicate a whole chapter to this, just to this very issue. So here are a few kind of overall thoughts, things that we really emphasize. One is you have to measure it. Culture can be measured. You need to look at how it is, whether it's effective. For example, is your culture cooperative or competitive? We like to think we're collaborating, but in fact, oftentimes we're not. And is that really the way we operate? We'll see, right? Second, that is, be preemptive. Think about culture before it goes wrong. Before you engage organizational change, make sure that your culture matches the strategy up front, rather than waiting for something to happen, or assuming if we make change, even structural change, the culture will somehow magically follow, right? It doesn't. And actually hold individual directors and others in the organization to account for their actual behavior. As one of our interviewees suggested, in using a letter of appointment that for the directors that he appointed, he spells out some very specific expectations. For example, he sets out an expectation that I expect you to earn the trust of everybody else on this board. They ask people at the end of every year how much trust and respect you have for other members of the board. It's anonymized, so you don't know who said what, and you're actually given that at the end of every year, right? That's hard, okay? But those are the kind of things that really break through and make a difference, particularly in times of change.
Now, we think we know why culture matters, but let's have a professorial answer to that question. Why does the culture matter?
Right, of course, culture is all about what we do and how we do it. You can't legislate, do the right thing for the right reason, right? You can try. There are lots of organizations and places in which we try to codify that, but it's actually really hard. And also, of course, it's judgment. What's right in one situation is not right in another situation. What employs value in my business might very well be different in your business. So it's not a simple matter of I could just easily, write this down. And yet, when I ask board members, is how important is this, right? Many of them kind of understand, but maybe don't know what to do about it. So, this idea of culture is critical to success in the boardroom. It tells us what's important, what's valuable, what's priority, what's not priority. and guides us in times of change and turbulence. So it's absolutely central to the success of any board and any organization.
And in terms of improving that cultural dimension, why don't you think that more rules make a difference? And what's not really working in the current environment and approaches to culture?
Well, let me say, evidence suggests having a good set of governance codes is important. I'm not going to deny that at all, and they are important. And what I think our argument has been, in most of the developed world where they take governance seriously, existing governance rules are pretty good. They help you cut through the kind of obvious potential for problem, but they're not sufficient, is what I think what we're saying. So our position here is that to stop board disasters, you need to have better behavior. And it's not because the rules are bad or insufficient, but because they're dealing with issues of behavior and culture that can't really be directed or directly legislated. And so you've got to be able to have people believe they do the right things for the right reasons and give people what those kind of values and cultural expectations are and allow them to use it in order to make better decisions.
And what would you say the key learning points from the book are, from your point of view as one of the authors?
Great. Well, I think the overall message from studying all these scandals is that boardroom disasters really are only going to stop when every director is trying to do the right thing for the right reason, and they have clarity about values and culture. No amount of official rules and sanctions is going to persuade directors. Regulators, shareholders, employees, citizens all have a role to play in ensuring that boards do the right things. Regulators can encourage better director education and understanding. Board assessors can ensure that boards measure and discuss culture. Citizens should stop normalizing business disasters. It's not just another one. We keep expecting this. We all have a role to play in making these disasters a thing of the past.
Thanks. And Gerry, a big question for you that you've thought a lot about and written a lot about, but the role of the independent directors, which we sometimes unfortunately still call non-executive directors, but the independent director, what can they do to prevent board scandals?
Well, Stefan, I would argue that the real custodians of the longevity of organisations are the independent directors, not the executive directors who come and go, as we know, and these days more frequently. But it's hard really to overemphasise the importance of the role of a board of directors. For example, business strategy, risk management, resourcing, investor relations, global understanding and governance. So the role of the independent directors is very wide. But some examples of the particular role they have with regard to improving board behaviour include improving board effectiveness, selecting the best chair for board leadership, selecting the best CEO, promoting independence within the board culture, which Randall was speaking about, and then maximising the contribution of all of the board committees, whether it's audit, remuneration, quality and nomination.
And what's the role of board training and evaluation?
Well, it may be strange to recognise the fact that currently, Stefan, there is no formal qualification requirement to be a company director, not one. This may seem strange because if you want to drive a car or operate a chainsaw, you need a legal qualification. And yet the range of characteristics and competencies needed to be a board director is in fact very wide. I'm just going to mention some of them. Mm-hmm. Personal qualities include integrity, leadership, cultural sensitivity, communication skills, independence. Then we've got professional and managerial competencies, strategy, problem solving, organising, the technical qualifications as well. And then we have got the entrepreneurial competencies, vision, commercial judgment, and conviction. With regard to the role of board evaluation, then I would say this is about promoting the continuous improvement of board effectiveness. Interesting, this has been a requirement now for some years with the combined code, but in fact, only about 30% of companies actually really carry out a proper board evaluation.
Lastly, Gerry, how can greater stakeholder governance and stakeholder engagement help to improve or even eradicate board dysfunction?
Well, Stefan, first of all, let's be clear, who are the stakeholders? They are not just the investors. They include employees, customers, suppliers, the community at large. Balancing the interests of these various stakeholders, which is the job of the board, is actually very difficult. But the evidence is that a more diverse board usually improves its performance. And by diversity, we are talking, of course, about gender, but also racial, also about different types of experiences, and also about age as well. Then the evidence is that effective stakeholder engagement can also play a very important role in reducing or preventing the 6 board dysfunctions which Randall was speaking about earlier. Now, the growing interest by investors in the ESG agenda and board performance is an example of a trend towards more attention being paid to stakeholder engagement and governance. Lastly, I would say this. In the conclusion of our book, we say that given the scale and complexity of problems which we face in the modern world, whether it's a war, whether it's climate, whether it's COVID, whether it's the issues of inflation, whatever they are, we badly need businesses to succeed. And in order for that to be achieved, we need better stakeholder engagement. We also, of course, need very good and excellent independent directors. But we also need much better education about the role of boards and their behaviour. And that's not just for company directors, that's really for everyone. Hence this book, because each one of us has a part to play if we're going to really improve the performance of businesses. Thank you.
Thanks, Gerry. Thanks, Randall. Now, as a reward for actually getting here today, ladies and gentlemen, who have actually got to London Business School, there's a chance, a couple of minutes for questions if anyone's been provoked, prompted into thinking something. If not, I will hog the floor and put my own questions to our authors. But any hands going up in the room, or responses or challenges to the authors? Yes, we've got one. Coming up. Thank you.
Hi. Okay. Hello. Dr. Joellen Prouty-McLaren here, and I'm one of the co-founders of Talent Sage. I'm very interested in how both of you might suggest a board would actually take the steps to start using and applying this framework in order to make improvements in how they actually work with their various companies and how they start to action some of the items and the ideas in the book. Would you mind commenting on that?
Some practical next steps and putting some of this into practice, making it real.
Right. Well, I think as I said before, these things can be measured. Board assessment is a really good place for that to happen. And so what I would love to see happen is that we find some way to create some recommended standard measures of each of these potential dysfunctions. We've got nice descriptions in the book. We don't have formal measures yet. But I would love to have them so that we could offer those to assessors to make sure, as a kind of health check with boards, that you don't come up particularly strong on any one of these. That would be my ideal.
Oh, very good, Randall. I would suggest you buy the book. And I'll tell
Good
you why.
advice.
Because in the back, it's got a director's checklist.
Yeah, it does.
A director's checklist. What, for example, needs to be done about improving independence? How do you deal with the whole issue of missing key voices? What about cultural amplification? How do we avoid a rules-bound culture? How to avoid groupthink? Then, what do we need to do to improve board culture? Then, how to improve board effectiveness? How to improve the quality of independent directors? How to improve stakeholder engagement? And lastly, the whole issue of board evaluation, and there are about 15 points there. So
There you go.
it's all there.
Always be selling. I think we've got another question from the other side of the room. Thank you.
Red Godfrey Sago from Sophie Hayes Foundation. Question on, is there a difference between bad board behaviour in the non-profit sector against the for-profit sector, and do you approach it differently?
Thank you. What a great question.
Could I volunteer
Come
to
in,
answer
Gerry,
that?
yes.
I volunteer to answer the question because I worked with another very distinguished business school, Henley, and we looked at the National Health Service, we looked at universities, we looked at charities, and we looked at sport. And we looked at all of the governance issues in those non-profit sectors, and we found that the issues were very much the same. There is a crisis of governance in the NHS. There's a crisis of governance in universities. There's a crisis of governance in charities, and there's a crisis of governance in sport. And anyone who doubts the latter needs to just reflect on the fact that the World Cup is being held in Qatar.
Okay, say no more. And unfortunately, the virtual questions are so virtual, they're not actually on my screen.
We'll go back in the room.
Yeah, thank you. Sorry about that, people at home. Thank you.
Here's a real one. Simon Osborne, LBS Leadership Institute. I agree, Gerry, with your point about there being no qualification to be a director, and I've challenged Sir John Thompson, the Chief Executive of the FRC, about whether the FRC will consider introducing some form of regulation of directors, and particularly CPD, and he refuses. I've challenged him twice at 2 events. His answers are pretty much the same. He says being a director is not a profession. Now, I would respectfully disagree with Sir John, because the role is becoming increasingly professionalised. Do you have any thoughts on that proposition?
Well, Simon, I would agree with you entirely. This is a battle, a campaign that the Institute of Directors have been fighting for a long time, and they still have not managed to persuade government that they should actually legislate on this matter. But I agree with you entirely. This is what really needs to be done, is we need a qualification. You shouldn't just be allowed to become a director of a company without being necessarily qualified to do that job. As I've already said, if you want to operate a chainsaw, you need a qualification. You want to drive a car, you have to have a qualification. You want to be an accountant, you need a qualification. You want to be an engineer, you need a qualification. You want to be a board director?
The one thing I would also add to that, I 100% agree with both of you, is there's even an easy way that I think you're alluding to, Simon, here, which is even if we don't have to have a certification, how about regular ongoing information and education? Every profession in the world, even non-professions in the world, you have to have regular ongoing training and information that you need to self-certify or whatever. And even that would be a huge step forward if we could just get things in front of them and on a regular basis that they need to know.
Okay, now I've got the screen, and the good question has come in. What is the role that cognitive bias plays in either the function or dysfunction of a board? What are the cognitive biases that we need to bring to the surface, perhaps, when we're evaluating boards?
Well, there certainly are cognitive biases going on in related to those dysfunctions. I don't know if I have a specific list off the top of my head, but what I will say is we know that those things operate, and we know that they operate quite strongly. So things like groupthink happen because everybody has this, desire, need to fit in, and that desire, goes wrong in an overdrive when we're in a high status position or new in high status position, and it can result in some dysfunction in the board. So absolutely, I know there'll be some psychological biases here as well.
Thank you. I think time for one more from our online audience. How about the role of the chair? The chair leads the board. Are there any examples of where a really good chair, in spite of himself, herself, in spite of the chair's actions, that disaster still ensued, even against the best efforts of a really good chair? Or does the chair inevitably get dragged into the dysfunction, no matter how confident, assertive they try to be?
Well, at the end of the day, I would say the most important influence on what happens on a board is the person who is the chair. They have an enormous amount of, I would say, responsibility for what takes place. And with that responsibility, of course, comes dealing with issues and problems. And I'm reflecting on the BP oil slick disaster which happened in the Gulf of Mexico. And certainly London Business School have carried out a detailed analysis into what happened there with regard to the board. And what happened was that there was a great deal of change going on. The chairman actually retired on the grounds of ill health. A new chairman was appointed who had no understanding whatsoever of the sector and had little experience in the USA. And yet, as we know, the Gulf of Mexico, where this incident happened, of course, one had to, at the end of the day, be dealing with the president of the USA in order to seek to resolve some of the claims for damages. Also in that situation, there were, unfortunately, a lot of other changes with regard to board directors. So along comes a disaster, and unless the board is actually very strong and well prepared, that disaster can overtake the company. And that is what happened to BP, with a cost to shareholders of $50 billion.
Thank you. Well, look, I think we're coming to the end of our time here today. Apologies to those of you who've kindly sent questions in online. I'm sure Randall and Gerry will get to have a look at them in due course, and do send more in. They'll follow up and take up your further questioning. I hope you've had some insight into business disasters and why the board has to get a grip before it's too late, preferably, preemptively. The book is on sale from Palgrave and Macmillan, or any good bookseller that you happen to know, online or in the real world. I'd like to just hand over to Gerry finally to say a couple of words just to round off our event today.
Well, first of all, Joe, thank you once again, everyone, for participating in the book launch and some of your difficult questions. I'm glad that Randall was here to answer that technical one about dysfunctional behaviour. Anyway, clearly a book is the result of an enormous amount of involvement by lots of people, and Randall and I have, in the introduction, thanked a whole list of people, including, I'm just looking at Carrie, who happens to be here and who carried out the research, for example, at LBS. But we also want to thank the reviewers, and we've had some superb reviews, as you will have seen at the beginning. We clearly want to thank the publisher, Palgrave Macmillan, for being bold in publishing the book. we certainly want to visit the speakers who joined us today, and then want to thank you, Stefan, very much indeed for chairing this event. My daughter is here, Cayetano, who runs Stray Cat. So we all know the importance of having wonderful daughters. Well, we've got a truly magnificent, wonderful daughter in so many ways. And here she is today with her team, including Gavin and Eggman and others, making this a great event to celebrate. So thank you very much. And Randall, I want to thank London Business School, obviously, for enabling us to be here. And lastly, I really would like to thank Randall for being a wonderful person to work with. This project is a result of this teamwork, and I just can't praise him too highly for a way in which we've managed to kind of work together and end up with, what we think is a pretty good book. So, thank you very much.
Well, thank you, Gerry. Look, that's the end of our event today, the business scandals and what to do about them. Thank you for joining us. For those of you who have been at the business school here this morning, you can move through the lower link bridge for refreshments and further chat. For those of you at home, make a cup of tea. And thanks to all of you for attending. See you soon.
Greed, conspiracies, and lies. These companies are guilty of them all.
Once you remove honesty, the whole stack of cards can come tumbling down.